Over the years, there have been many requests for classic, extinct Universal attractions to return to the parks. This trend came to a head when Jaws closed in 2012, as it had a massive cult following, being an opening day attraction at Universal Studios Florida, and with Universal's popularity overall being at the highest it's ever been at that point, with Harry Potter just opening up 2 years earlier. Though people had their own opinions about which ride should come back, pretty much every single person you ask would always say, bring back Jaws, bring back Back to the Future, and bring back Confrontation. Well, in 2016, Universal did just that, with King Kong coming back with a new ride in Islands of Adventure with Skull Island Reign of Kong. Now, although it is a new King Kong ride, it is nothing like Confrontation in any way, shape, or form, though it does have the nod with the massive King Kong animatronic at the end of the ride. Before this ride came out, I'm gonna be honest, I was a firm believer that Universal would never bring back these old attractions. I thought for sure that Universal was of the mindset of constantly keeping new, keeping fresh, keeping up with the times, and not going back to things they'd done in the past and relying on nostalgia, because I thought, that's kind of Disney's thing, right? But with the comeback of Kong, and now this new legacy store that celebrates these old attractions, as well as plenty of merch going around with these old attractions on them, I think it's clear that through Universal's own research and experimentation that they found out that there is interest in these old attractions beyond just a small, loud minority online. There is certainly a broad interest in these properties coming back, especially considering that many of these properties were only open for a few years after Harry Potter opened, or weren't even open before Harry Potter was there. So a lot of people who are currently going to the parks now, or are big fans of the parks now, never even got to experience these attractions. So with that all being said, let's waste no more time and let's get into which attractions actually stand a chance of coming back in the near future. Let's start off with the one that most of you are probably here for and started this whole trend when it closed in 2012, and that is Jaws. Although Jaws had plenty of issues over the years from an operational standpoint, there is no doubt about it that is one of the most unique attractions that Universal has ever offered, and neither they nor anybody else has ever made a ride anything quite like it. It was a great attraction, there's no doubt about that. But if I'm going to be honest, its replacement, Diagon Alley, it was inevitable. Not because it's just Harry Potter, but because of how much space Jaws took up at a park that does not have that much space to work with. The fact they were able to build a whole land on top of that space. I mean, you think about the land, quote unquote, the Amity area surrounding Jaws, that is basically where the London area is, right? The rest of that land, the whole Diagon Alley part of the land, is where the ride was. So that just goes to show you how much space that ride was taking up. Today, outside of the Legacy store, you can find Jaws hanging around in the San Francisco area, and you can also find the bathrooms that are still there from when the Amity Land was still around. Now, of course, we know that the ride is extremely popular, has a cult following, and that is still relevant today. But the question is, does the property itself, the Jaws franchise, still have legs to this day? Well, that's kind of tough to say. I mean, the movie is so old, 1975. It is really old, especially compared to any other property that's currently in the parks today. But there are some positive things going for it. One, it still is a classic movie that people will still watch every year. On top of this, there were rumors a while ago of a reboot. I have no idea if those are true anymore. And then, of course, you have the concept. The concept that is so universally relatable no matter which generation you're talking to. The fear of sharks. So long as that is still tied to the franchise, which of course that is the whole franchise, it's still going to be popular with guests at a theme park. Because it doesn't really matter if Jaws itself is popular, people will still go on it to experience a shark attack. That is just something that every generation is going to have some interest in. So Jaws might not necessarily have the strongest legs to stand on given its age, but let's be honest, it's got one of the best chances of coming back, at least from that perspective. However, you got some big shoes to fill. I mean, the Jaws ride, so beloved, so hyped up. Like I said, this ride was the whole reason that this trend started. This is what got it all started to bring these rides back, because people really want to see Jaws back. There are whole accounts dedicated to bringing Jaws back. People are obsessed with this ride and how good and how unique it was. How, as Universal Creative, do you follow up on that? How in the world are you supposed to live up to the expectations that are set for you based on what that ride was? Like Kong before it, the ride would have to be different than the original one, not only because of how much space it took up, but also because of how, expensive it was to operate. So the creative team would have to come up with something completely new that is still extremely unique and lives up to the expectations set for it by the community, which at this moment in time are at an all-time high. I mean, how do you live up to it? Obviously, if you do well, it will be a phenomenal success. People will love you forever for it. But if you fail, well, then you completely messed up. You just wasted millions of dollars. You know, it will be fine, but people will always say, oh, the old Jaws ride was better. And that's just not what you want. That's not the comparison you want to draw. You want to say, hey, we were better than that, right? Especially considering that Jaws only closed 9 years ago. I mean, it's still going to be very fresh in people's minds, especially considering how much of a cult classic it is today. So you're not going to get the same benefit of the doubt that maybe Kong did when its new ride came out. So yes, to put it plainly, I do think that this ride has a good chance of coming back in a different fashion, but man, are the expectations going to be high, and it's going to be intimidating for Universal Creative to take on, and that may be the main reason why it may not come back. Going from one of the big dogs to one of the lesser talked about properties, and that's Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice, of course, had a show at Universal Studios that lasted for 24 years before being closed in 2016 to make way for Fast and Furious Supercharged. Oof. Despite getting rid of his show, clearly Universal has found use for the character of Beetlejuice, as he still is a very common walk-around character in the parks, and he's been cold opening for the horror makeup show for quite some time now. On top of this, Universal also gave him a Halloween Horror Nights house, which was open just for a few days in 2020, but will be open for the whole Halloween Horror Nights season in 2021. So clearly, Beetlejuice still has legs within the park itself. However, even outside the parks, this franchise still has legs as well. Now, there's never been a sequel to the movie, though there's been talks about it possibly happening, but the big thing with Beetlejuice that's happened over the last few years is Beetlejuice the Musical, which has been a massive success on Broadway, and has really kind of brought a lot of new faces to the Beetlejuice franchise who maybe would have never thought about seeing it previously. With all this new attention, honestly, the Beetlejuice franchise is as popular as it's ever been. So if there's any time to bring Beetlejuice back, now is the time to do so. Now, Beetlejuice's original show, Beetlejuice Graveyard Review, wasn't really so much a venue for him, but more so an avenue for Universal to push their classic monsters onto people, and he was just the host. However, in his Halloween Horror Nights house, they go deeper into the lore of Beetlejuice, and they go through all these great worlds and aspects of that story and of that character. However, I'm pretty confident in saying that they could take this to a whole nother level if they would give Beetlejuice a ride of his own. It would be something that we haven't seen before, and we could go deeper into the worlds like the underworld and that sand area where that monster is. I don't even know what that technically is. But there are so many more things you can go into deeper with when it comes to Beetlejuice's world and the characters within it. For instance, the Halloween Horror Nights house just follows the plot of the film. I'd like to see an attraction that actually creates its own story within that world, and that could be something that people would really gravitate towards. Next, I want to talk about Hanna-Barbera. You know, the characters of Scooby-Doo, the Flintstones, Jetsons, Yogi Bear, you name them. They got them all. And there was a ride, an opening day attraction to the fantastic world of Hanna-Barbera that lasted until 2002. It was the OG screen ride. It was the only screen ride that opened in the park, as Back to the Future didn't open up until a year later, and it's pretty much been the blueprint for everything that's come since then. Though many of these characters will be forever known and forever well beloved, the one character that really stands out and still has legs to this day is Scooby-Doo, as evident by his presence in the park today, as he still appears as a walk-around character. On top of this, and I guess I don't have to spell it out for you, but of course Scooby-Doo did just have a new anime movie come out last year. He still has legs, he still has a production company that is confident in him. He will be the most popular of these properties for a long time. The question is, does bringing him back and giving him his own attraction make sense? You see, the Scooby-Doo theme park rights have kind of changed hands several times over the years. It used to be at Cedar Fair parks you used to be able to find him, and then he was at Six Flags for a couple of years. But fairly recently, he was removed from those parks, so you don't have to worry about regional parks being able to say, hey, we got Scooby-Doo at home, don't go to Universal, go here. Instead, they could have a wholly owned, wholly unique Scooby-Doo attraction at Universal that wouldn't be getting undercut by any regional attractions. However, with that being the case, there are still two things that I think hurt its chances of coming back. One, we already have plenty of classic cartoons in the park, from Woody Woodpecker to Dudley Do-Right to Popeye. I'm not really sure if Universal wants to bring in more of those as mainstay attractions, considering that they're probably trying to get rid of most of those, so that hurts. And the other thing is, we talked about Universal appeal with Jaws and the shark attack thing. The universal appeal behind Scooby-Doo is monsters. Universal has a whole land coming to Epic Universe for their own classic monsters. Does it make sense to come up with another monster ride geared maybe more towards kids in a different park? I don't know. I don't really know if that makes sense to have that much of a monster presence across all your parks. Especially when you consider that unlike the Mummy and the Universal Classic Monsters, Universal would not own the rights to Scooby-Doo and they'd be promoting somebody else's brand. So I wouldn't get your hopes up for Scooby-Dooby-Doo. Speaking of children's properties, what about Barney, which just recently closed this year?
Won't you say you love me too?
No, I won't say I love you too, because you're not coming back, kid. Get out of here. Barney's done. I don't even know if that show's still on TV. You're not coming back, kid. Nobody even knows who you are. They didn't even replace you. They just closed you because nobody even was going to your show. Get out of here. Anyways, moving on. Next up, we got an interesting one in Ghostbusters. Now, honestly, I wouldn't even be a little bit surprised if a lot of you people didn't even know that there was a Ghostbusters attraction at Universal Studios Florida back in the day. Yeah, it opened in 1990, opening day, closed 6 years later in 1996, a very short run for an attraction. And up until now, with the Legacy Store, was mostly forgotten by Universal and wasn't really given any other sort of love, other than the fact that the firehouse is still somewhat there, it's still somewhat noticeable. Other than that, there's really nothing else Ghostbusters related that's left in the park, with the one exception being the Halloween Horror Nights house from a few years back. Now, as far as its relevancy today, I would still say Ghostbusters has legs. They got a new movie coming out this year. They had a movie in 2016, although that maybe took them a few steps back. And the original films are still well beloved today. And like Jaws, it does have that universal appeal of course, ghosts. So with all this behind it, does Ghostbusters actually have a chance of coming back to the parks in the future? And honestly, I think it does. I mean, Universal still shares a relationship with Sony, as Men in Black is a Sony property. And because the original attraction was a show, not even a ride, and closed so many years ago, there's really endless possibilities for you to bring Ghostbusters back without it even being resembled to the original attraction, as most people who will be riding it will have never even been on it or probably even have heard of it. So really, when it comes to selling this as a new attraction, it shouldn't be difficult at all. And honestly, I think the possibilities are pretty endless for what they could do with this property. I mean, there's so many different avenues you can take. And what's nice to see is that this doesn't have to be a solely screen attraction. I mean, we saw in that show that they used completely practical effects. Why not bring those to an actual ride for Ghostbusters? I think that could be awesome. So honestly, assuming that this movie coming out doesn't completely flop and kill the franchise, I do think Ghostbusters has a pretty solid chance of coming to the park, even though it is a third-party property. Speaking of third-party properties, let's talk about Terminator 2 3D, better known as T2 3D. This show lasted a whopping 21 years before it closed in 2017 to make way for the Bourne Stuntacular. Though for many years after the ride closed, you were able to find Terminator merch as the gift shop was still open after it closed. Now with Bourne moved in, you really can't find Terminator much of anywhere in the park outside of the Legacy Store. As far as the well-being of the franchise today, it's obviously still very popular, but as we know, Paramount has kind of struggled to get the franchise going again, with many attempts to kind of reboot it or restart it or just kick it off again, whatever you may call it, with Terminator Genisys being such a failure that Universal actually implemented new scenes and new changes to T2 3D when that movie came out, and then closed the ride 2 years later because that movie did so bad. So, I mean, you know, it's in a really rough spot. We'll have to see if they continue with the Dark Fate timeline, but as it looks right now, who knows what's going on with the Terminator franchise. It really is just too big of a question mark right now for Universal to make any sort of permanent move like that on the property. Now, that all being said, I do think there's still a home for Terminator at the parks in the future, and I think that comes at Halloween Horror Nights with the haunted house. That is something they haven't done yet. And it seems like a no-brainer to me, having these robots come and chase you. I mean, that would just be amazing with their red eyes glaring through the darkness. I mean, come on, that is like a no-brainer. I think that that's got to be something that comes down the line, so long as Paramount allows it. And I think that that's more likely where Terminator is going to show up again in the parks, as opposed to an attraction, at least until Paramount can figure out what the heck they're doing with that movie franchise. Next on the list are a few rides that I've thrown in together, that being Earthquake/Disaster and Twister. Both of these attractions followed the natural disaster universal appeal through simulating natural disasters for guests to experience in a safe environment. With the exception of Disaster, it may be interesting for you to know that both Earthquake and Twister are based on movies. Twister, maybe you're not too surprised because that was a movie that came out in the 90s and is still somewhat relevant today, with I think a reboot maybe on the way. Earthquake was a movie from 1974 that they made a ride for at Universal Studios Florida. And it's not a movie many people have seen. I've only personally seen it because it was at the park and I was curious to go and see what the heck it was all about. And it was honestly pretty good. It has a really good John Williams score on it. John Williams, the guy who did Jurassic Park and E.T. scores. So if you like that, go ahead and check it out. But, you know, it's not something that's super popular or super relevant today. So, I mean, you talk about bringing back Earthquake or even Twister, which I don't think is that relevant today either. These were not massive movie franchises, so they don't really have much legs. The only thing they have going for them are that universal appeal of natural disasters, which isn't really super existent at the Universal parks today. But if we're being honest, the only way these two rides come back, since they're really not that popular, would have to be if a very big fan theory were to come true, and that's that there's a whole land dedicated to old school attractions, presumably in Epic Universe. Obviously that's not in the current plans, but there are 2 expansion paths where maybe this could go, and the idea would be that there will be a bunch of classic attractions, most likely Jaws, Back to the Future, maybe Ghostbusters, and then you have some smaller ones, which maybe where Twister and Earthquake could potentially fit in, even though they wouldn't really sell as a ride on their own. They could be good fits for a whole land to kind of help fill it out. Now, honestly, I don't necessarily think a land like this is going to happen, but I think the possibility is still there because my biggest concern was like, how the heck do you even make a land like this themed properly? Well, I think it's pretty obvious based on what the Legacy store looks like. We could probably go with that and be like, oh, it would probably look like something like out of Raiders of the Lost Ark, and it would just be, you know, this basically giant backlot, and we would return to this kind of style of ride the movies, but instead of ride the movies, it'd be ride the rides. So that would be the only circumstance I would see either of these attractions coming back in the future. Now, that brings us to last, but certainly not least, Back to the Future the ride. One of those top 3 contenders to come back. Obviously, Kong has already come back. We've already talked about Jaws, so we are here at Back to the Future the ride. The ride opened up in 1991, 1 year after Universal Studios Florida opened, and it lasted until 2007, spanning a course of 16 years. It closed to make way for The Simpsons. Today, you can find Back to the Future in the park with the DeLorean and the train from Back to the Future Part 3 being on display very close to where the old ride used to be, as well as a walk-around Doc Brown character. Now, as you know, the ride was immensely popular, but even though there hasn't been a movie in the franchise since the 90s, I would say the Back to the Future property is still immensely popular today, with a show coming out on Discovery Plus just recently about Christopher Lloyd, the guy who played Doc Brown, going to get Michael J. Fox, the guy who played Marty McFly, some sort of Back to the Future related gift. I don't even know, but I saw that and I was like, wow, Back to the Future still has legs if they're making stuff like this about the franchise. And of course, this goes without saying, but you got the universal appeal there of time travel. So yeah, the property itself is still valid. There's a lot of different things you can do with the franchise outside of what you did with the original ride, considering that a lot of the things there are pretty outdated technology-wise and graphics-wise and whatnot. I mean, there's so many better things you can do there. You don't even have to go all digital. You can go and bring in some practical effects for the ride. There are so many more things you can do. And I know the one issue that a lot of people are going to bring up about why Back to the Future maybe can't come back is because of the age of the actors, right? Maybe you need to bring them back to really make it work. I disagree. I think that the DeLorean and the time travel aspect in and of itself will be enough to bring the franchise back, even if you didn't bring the ride back in time to be able to bring back Christopher Lloyd or Michael J. Fox to reprise their roles in any sort of way. I think that honestly, it is totally okay to not have them involved, and this could still be a great attraction. Plus, you don't have to worry about living up to the attraction the same way that Jaws does because your ride was just a regular screen ride. There's so many more things you could do with the franchise outside of that. It wouldn't be hard at all to live up to the original. So, with that being said, what do you guys think? Let me know which one of these rides you think is actually going to come back, which ones you don't think stand a chance. Maybe you don't even think that any rides will come back. Let me know in the comments. I love to hear what you have to say, and I'll see you next time. Peace.